4 days ago, Alex Eala walked off court 14 at Roland Garros after losing to Iva Jovic 4-6, 2-6. It was clinical. It was brief. And if you only follow tennis casually, you might have scrolled past it and concluded that Eala's spring was a disappointment. You'd be wrong, but I understand why you'd think that. Here's the thing that keeps nagging at me, though. In about 72 hours, Eala is scheduled to step onto grass at the Birmingham Open. And the conversation I keep having with other analysts, the one that won't leave me alone, is this. What happens if, somewhere during this grass court season, Alex Eala draws Aryna Sabalenka? Not on clay, where Eala has won barely 40% of her career matches. Not on an indoor hard court with controlled conditions. On grass. The surface where Eala's game suddenly makes a different kind of sense. Now, Birmingham itself is a WTA 125. Sabalenka isn't in the draw. She doesn't need to be at a 125. But grass court season is compressed. It squeezes everyone into a 4-week window, and the paths converge quickly toward Eastbourne, toward Queens, toward Wimbledon. These two have never played each other. 0 head-to-head. And I think the first time they do meet, which feels increasingly inevitable given Eala's trajectory, the surface it happens on will tell us more about both of them than the scoreline will. So let me walk you through why this matchup fascinates me. Not as a fantasy booking exercise, but as a genuine tactical puzzle that reveals something specific about where women's tennis is heading right now. Start with what Eala actually did this season before the French Open derailed the narrative. She reached the quarterfinals in Abu Dhabi and Dubai. In Dubai, she beat Jasmine Paolini, the world number 8 at the time, 6-1, 7-6. That's her third career top 10 win. She's 21 years old. The other two? Madison Keys and Iga Swiatek, both at the 2025 Miami Open, where Eala ran through the draw as a wild card to reach the semifinals. We're not talking about a player who occasionally troubles good opponents. We're talking about someone who has specifically demonstrated she can dismantle elite-level games when the conditions let her play her brand of tennis. And that qualifier, when the conditions let her, is the entire story. Eala's career win rate on clay is around 41%. On hard courts, it hovers near 44% at WTA level. But on grass? 65%. That's not a small sample size fluke. That's 15 wins from 23 matches heading into the season, including a run to the Eastbourne final last summer where she beat Ons Jabeur, Jelena Ostapenko, and Diana Yastremska, the last of those 6-1, 6-2, before pushing Maya joint to 12-10 in a final set tiebreak. The reason for this surface split is not mysterious. It's mechanical. Eala is left-handed. Her serve, which has been the most discussed weakness of her career, behaves differently on grass. A left-handed serve on grass pulls wide to the ad court with natural slice that stays low and skids through the surface. On clay, that same serve sits up. Opponents read the spin, plant their feet, and drive through it. On hard courts, it's manageable but not dangerous. On grass, it becomes genuinely awkward to return. Her first serve win percentage at Eastbourne last year was meaningfully higher than anything she'd posted on clay or hard courts in 2025, and the placement data showed why. She was hitting wider angles on the deuce court that physically dragged opponents off the court in ways that weren't reproducible on slower surfaces. This matters for the Sabalenka question because of how Sabalenka builds points. Sabalenka's game is built on early aggression from the baseline. She wants to step inside the court, take the ball on the rise, and dictate with raw pace, usually through the backhand, which is one of the most devastating shots in women's tennis today. Her 2026 season has been historically dominant. The Sunshine Double at Indian Wells and Miami, a 27-3 record through the French Open, 3 titles, and a stranglehold on the #1 ranking that hasn't loosened since January. But here's what gets lost in the dominance narrative. Sabalenka's grass court career record is 41 wins, 21 losses. That's a 66% win rate, good, not dominant, and notably her weakest surface by percentage. She reached the Wimbledon semifinals in both 2023 and 2025, losing to Jabeur and Anisimova respectively, and she has never won a grass court title above 250 level. Her lone grass title came at Hertogenbosch in 2022. At Berlin last year, Vondrousova dismantled her in straight sets in the semis. The pattern in those grass court losses is consistent enough to build an argument around. When Sabalenka loses on grass, she loses because the low bounce shortens her swing path on the backhand. She generates extraordinary topspin off that wing. It's what makes the shot so heavy on hard courts and clay, but grass doesn't reward topspin the same way. The ball stays low, skids through, and forces her to either shorten her backswing or hit up through contact. When she shortens the backswing, she loses the spin that keeps the ball in. When she hits up, she tends to float the ball into the middle of the court. It's a narrow technical problem, but it's one that better movers and slicier opponents have exploited. Amanda Anisimova, who beat Sabalenka at Wimbledon last year, did it by keeping the ball low, varying pace, and refusing to give Sabalenka the rhythm she needs to load up. Vondrousova did something similar in Berlin, using slice and angles to prevent Sabalenka from settling into her forehand-to-backhand pattern. Eala, tactically, sits somewhere between those two templates. She doesn't have Vondrousova's touch around the net. She doesn't have Anisimova's serve. What she has is something different, a lefty's natural geometry that disrupts the standard baseline exchange pattern most right-handers rely on. Think about what happens when a left-hander rallies cross-court with a right-hander. The default cross-court exchange runs forehand to forehand. Against a righty, Sabalenka's cross-court forehand lands on the opponent's forehand, and the rally stays on her terms because she's generally the more powerful player in that exchange. Against Eala, that same cross-court forehand lands on Eala's backhand, which is actually her more reliable wing from the baseline. And when Eala hits cross-court with her forehand, she's targeting Sabalenka's backhand, which is precisely the shot that grass makes more vulnerable. This is the geometry that makes the matchup interesting. It's not about Eala being better. She isn't. It's about the angles being structurally unfavorable for Sabalenka's preferred rally patterns in ways that are amplified on a low-bouncing surface. Now, I need to be honest about the other side of this. Eala's serve, even with the grass court improvement, is still a liability against Sabalenka's return game. Sabalenka is one of the best returners in women's tennis. She stands close to the baseline, takes the return early, and looks to hurt you immediately on the second shot of the rally. Eala's average first serve speed has climbed. She hit 105 miles per hour at points during the hard court season, up from below 90 miles per hour consistently in 2025, but her second serve remains a problem. Her second serve win rate across the 2026 season has been below average, and against a returner of Sabalenka's caliber, holding serve would require her to win a disproportionate number of first serve points. On grass, she can do that. The surface helps. The left-handed angles help. The skid helps. But if the first serve percentage dips below 55% in any given set, the math turns ugly fast because Sabalenka's return will punish every second serve that lands short or central. The other factor working against Eala is experience under sustained pressure from a world number one. Her top 10 wins over Keys, Swiatek, and Paolini all share a pattern. She performed brilliantly in the first set, establishing an emotional and tactical foothold before her opponent could adjust. Against Keys in Miami, she won the first set 6-2. Against Swiatek, 6-2 again. Against Paolini in Dubai, 6-1. In each case, she was operating with house money, the underdog with nothing to lose, and her opponents were the ones scrambling to figure out the lefty patterns they hadn't prepared for. Sabalenka doesn't scramble the same way. Her response to adversity is to hit harder. Sometimes that self-destructs, and you saw that at Wimbledon against Anisimova. She acknowledged afterward that she had to physically remind herself not to smash rackets, that she was fighting her own temperament more than her opponent. But more often than not in 2026, the sheer volume of her ball striking has overwhelmed opponents who took early leads. She saved a championship point against Rybakina in the Indian Wells final and still won the match in a deciding tiebreak. That kind of resilience isn't tactical. It's constitutional. So here is the honest question. If Eala takes the first set, which I think she's capable of doing on grass, where the geometry and surface align with her game, can she sustain it when Sabalenka inevitably raises her level? I think the answer depends on something specific that nobody talks about enough: how Eala manages the transition game on grass. By transition game, I mean the 2 or 3 shots between the serve and the baseline rally. On grass, points are shorter. The player who controls the first 3 shots, serve, return, and the first ground stroke, wins a disproportionate share of points compared to clay or hard courts, where longer rallies allow the better athlete or the more consistent player to grind out advantages over time. Eala's Eastbourne run showed she understood this. She was jumping on short returns and driving her forehand inside out before opponents could recover position. She was using the serve +1 pattern, wide serve to the ad court, then forehand into the open space, more aggressively and more successfully than at any point in her career. Against Sabalenka, that pattern becomes a coin flip. If Eala's serve pulls Sabalenka wide and the return comes back soft, Eala has a genuine look at a forehand winner or a setup shot. If the serve doesn't pull Sabalenka wide enough, if it's an inch too central or the speed drops on the second serve, Sabalenka's return becomes the weapon, and Eala is the one scrambling. The margins are that thin. And on grass, where a single break of serve can decide a set, those margins are the match. I'll tell you what I think would actually happen, and I'm not going to dress it up with qualifications. I think Sabalenka wins in 3 sets. I think Eala takes the first set somewhere around 6-4, riding the lefty serve and the awkward geometry. I think Sabalenka solves the puzzle in the second set, probably by moving further inside the baseline on return and flattening out her backhand instead of trying to generate the topspin that grass won't reward. And I think the third set comes down to whether Eala can hold her nerve in a sequence of tight service games against a player who is simply better at closing matches than almost anyone alive right now. The scoreline I'd project is something like 4-6, 6-3, 6-4 Sabalenka. A match that would look comfortable in the final score but wouldn't feel comfortable for Sabalenka while it was happening. A match where the analysts would say Eala competed well, and the fans would feel gutted because competing well isn't what they're watching her for anymore. But here's why the loss would matter more than most wins. Eala is 21. She's ranked 37 and climbing. Her game has a specific, identifiable edge on grass that isn't going away. Left-handedness isn't something you adjust out of your game. Every season, she spends improving that serve, working with Joan Bosch at the Nadal Academy on her first strike patterns, and adding experience in high-pressure situations against top players. The gap between her grass court level and the level required to beat Sabalenka gets narrower. She doesn't need to surprise Sabalenka. Surprising someone implies you've done something they didn't expect. What Eala needs is for Sabalenka to expect her best and still not have a clean answer for it. That's not where she is yet. But the surface where it becomes possible first? That's grass. And the window opens this week in Birmingham, continues through Eastbourne and Queens, and closes at Wimbledon. I don't think the first meeting between these two will produce the result Eala's fans want. But I think it'll produce something they need, proof that the matchup has a fault line Sabalenka can feel. And in women's tennis right now, knowing where the fault line is and having the specific tools to exploit it is more valuable than any single result. Watch how Eala serves in Birmingham this week. Not the speed. The placement. Watch whether she's going wider on the ad side than she did on clay, whether the percentage holds above 60, and whether the point is effectively over by the third shot. If those numbers look right, then the Sabalenka match, whenever it comes, won't be a question of whether Eala can surprise her. It'll be a question of whether Sabalenka can solve something that grass court tennis hasn't let anyone solve comfortably in a very long time: a lefty who knows exactly where the angles go and is getting better at hitting them every month.